gentleman that was talking a lot about forage finishing and pasture finishing. So I thought this would apply to this county and be of interest. And I already had the presentation together. So I worked with a meat scientist friend of mine at University of Arkansas, Jason Apple. I had spent about 21 years in Arkansas working for the university there. So Jeremy Powell, he's a veterinarian on staff, and he had control of one of the cow herds that we used for some of the research, and we'll cover. And Thomas Glasscock was the graduate student who did some of the work. I wanted to show a little bit of some of the research that has been done in forage finishing beef. Susan Duckett, she's at Clemson, but we work in graduate school together here at Oklahoma State. She's a meat scientist, and she had a pretty neat study back when she was in Georgia, and they had these cattle. They preconditioned them for 45 days, and then they finished them on pasture for 89, 146, or 201 days before finishing. And if you look at the age of slaughter, they were from about 500 days of age up to 600 days of age, so nearly 2.5 years. So if you do the math, if you had 45 days and 89 days, they were about yearlings whenever they started this. So they were pretty mature. Looking at the gain, if you're going to keep them on pasture for 200 days, you're going to go through a lot of cycles in forage quality. So it was a mixed grass, bluegrass, orchard grass, called fescue, and white clover, which are all full season grasses. But this is, back in the northern part of Georgia where they grow for a good bit of the year. So anyway, they went from about 2 3/4 pounds a day down to about 2 pounds a day. And one of the keys from this is, even though they're pretty old and they're gaining weight fairly well, still our slaughter weights are only about 750 to 950 pounds. And when you look at the hot carcass weights, it's extremely light, especially that's about what one side of an animal will weigh from a lot of our feedlot animals. Fat thickness, we expect to try to get cattle up to about a 1/2 inch in back fat. These were right at about 1 inch, so they didn't even have a real good cover on them by the time they were slaughtered. But even though these cattle were fairly small and fairly skinny, the Warner Black Bratzler shear force on them wasn't all that bad, especially for the ones that were younger at the time. That 5 pounds of shear force would be considered to be on the verge of slightly tough. But we're getting, even though these are younger, and that's the reason why these are more tender. As they got older, they got tougher, and that's one of the things. But also, the quality grade on these, they had very little margin by the time they were slaughtered. Standard grade, they're not even going to get graded in today's market. Select, we're getting to see fewer and fewer of those. But, that extra 50 days really didn't increase the quality grade that much. Guillermo Scaglia, he's in South Louisiana. He did this work when he was in Virginia. He's originally from Uruguay, where they forage finish everything. So he's a really, really smart guy, a good friend of mine. He compared some different forages. Annual ryegrass finished on Bermuda grass, mixed grasses, the ryegrass, rye, clover mixtures, and then on a summer mixed grass, and then forage soybeans and ground sorghum and different annuals. And that's one of the things a lot of people do when they're forage finishing animals. To get them through that slump in the summer, we try to put them on summer annuals that are going to be higher in quality. He did a better job of getting these cattle bigger, right at 1,100 pounds. Carcass weights right at 600 pounds. Fat thickness, they were right at 0.2 inches, 1/4 inch. Slightly bigger ribeye than the previous study. Even though these cattle were bigger and slightly fatter, whenever you forage finished cattle, one of the big complaints is dressing percent. we're expecting our modern feedlot finished cattle to be about 64%. These cattle were only about 54%. But also, irregardless of where these cattle were finished, they were, on average, a select quality grade. So they're better modeled than that previous study. They were fatter. The fat thickness was better. A lot of the different was in the systems. They had to feed hay, at certain points, different days. They spent grazing each different thing. The income on this was actually fairly interesting. They netted about $700 per steer on these, and $500 per steer on these two programs that didn't rely on annuals. And whenever they had to have the seeding and all the costs of putting in annuals, that really decreased the profit in that program, which was fairly interesting to look at. One more forage finishing study. These cattle were finished on Bermuda grass, Indian grass, or a mixture of these tall grass prairie species during the spring and summer, and then they were put on tall fescue before slaughter. They were about 1,100 or 1,200 pounds. We had a fairly good with this Indian grass, which is a very high quality tall grass prairie species. It's grown here and throughout the southeast, but it's more common here in Oklahoma and Kansas anymore. On these other programs, especially that Bermuda grass, we're only looking at about 15% select, and the rest of them were standard. So not much marbling. There's not a lot of energy in Bermuda grass to really get them fat. Once again, with these cattle, Warner Bracks or shear force or tenderness, they would be considered slightly tough. The flavor was fairly intense. They were still, moderate in juiciness and tenderness, but the overall acceptability by these consumer panels was fairly low. Whenever we look at, this is a grouping of 23 different studies from the late 70s all the way through the 2013, and you can tell with these cattle in feedlot gaining about 2.5 pounds a day, there's some dated information in there. But with the comparison, cattle in feedlot gained about a pound more. They weighed about 140 pounds more at slaughter. Hot carcass weight was, a little over 100 pounds more. That dressing percent, we have, a lot more gut fill when cattle are on forage. And also dressing percent goes up as cattle get fatter. As they're slaughtered, there's about twice as much back fat. This is, that 0.48 is right at where we really want them to be. The key, if you look at the back of your hand, that's too fat because you can't see any ribs. You look at this part, that's about right. You can't feel the ribs, but you can kind of see the indentation. Well, those grass-finished cattle, they were more like right here where you can see and feel all the ribs. They're just not quite fatty enough yet. Ribeye area, much smaller, so the red meat yield is going to be a lot lower. Standard quality grade versus choice, for these. So once again, the feedlot cattle were more tender. That shear force value was lower. One of the things that I saw Susan Duckett, who I brought up, at the first slide, she had presented some of this data at the Beef Industry Federation and some of it at another conference that I was at. And when we look at the health benefits, you read, if you do a Google search on forage finishing or grass finishing or anything, you find a lot of information about how much healthier it is than feedlot finishing and all of these different things. So on a 3-ounce portion of fat, hamburger, your normal grass-finished animal would be lower in fat because there's not as much fat on that carcass. If you buy, meat at a grocery store, this would be about 3 grams of fat instead of 6 grams of fat from that feedlot finished animal. If you bought the higher lean type hamburger, at the store, or had it ground yourself and you had it ground leaner, it would have less fat. But compared to pork loin, we're looking at a lot less fat even for a feedlot finished animal. When we look at saturated fat, which is fairly common, the rumen will take unsaturated fat and use it as a hydrogen sink to fully saturate it. We will get more saturated fat in feedlot animals, about double compared to the grass finished. But then again, something like pork has more saturated fat than the other. Monounsaturated fat is similar relationship. The CLA, the conjugated linoleic acid, in both grass-finished and feedlot animals is fairly substantial, where there's really none in the pork or the simple stomach animals, whether it be pork or poultry or a lot of those. And the omega-6 to omega-3 relationship that they talk about, the inflammation index, how much inflammation do you get, or how much will this cure as far as, inflammatory response in the body. It is better, at about 2 for, the grass finished, but that 4 for the feedlot animal is well within the recommended. And when you look at pork and the others from the monogastrics, it is much higher. So grass finished is fatter, or higher in, grain finished is higher in fat than finished beef. Well, that just makes sense because we can get them fatter in the feedlot, and we do. But if we do get the grass finished animals to the same level of fat, they'll be the same. They are similar in saturated fat. They're similar in monounsaturated fat. Both are below the recommended ratio of 4:1. And we can create feedlot diets or grain-based diets that will give us the same CLA and omega-6 to omega-3 ratio as grass-finished feed. So. Jason had come up with this Hayek and Garrett, and I'm not even sure where they're from. They looked at just a standard feedlot versus a standard finishing program, looking at the average daily gain we expect, and for right now we expect to have about 22 million fat cattle slaughtered in the United States. With a slaughter weight of about 1,400 pounds. And that's about 12 billion pounds of beef from feedlot cattle. The rest of it that we get comes from cold breeding stock, non-fed steers, heifers, veal, and all that. That's about 10 million more pounds. But we would need to replace 13 million cattle if we go completely to grass finishing. And whenever we look at that, total cattle on feed, we would need about 387 million to create the same amount of product that we do from the finishing program we have. So that would take about 24% increase in beef cow calf herd from 63 million up to 79 million. To replace the 22 million head feedlot placements, we have to have 27 million feedlot placements. and get up to 43% increase in methane. Total methane emissions in the United States would increase by 8%. We saw on Facebook over the last few weeks, there's a lot of infographics coming up about, the minuscule amount of methane created by agriculture and how very small part of that is from beef cattle. And, that 8% increase in total, because we're grass finishing everything, would be a huge, reflect a huge change in that. Plus, we couldn't sustain all the animals on grass that we would need just to replace the beef production that we have. So, while I was in Arkansas, Jason and I had come up with a project, and we had worked on it for a couple of different years and used cattle from our research station in a couple of different areas. We wanted to look at the value of carcasses from a conventional grain finish program to a grass-based program where we supplement with a high amount of corn grain to push the performance of these cattle. And his goal as a meat scientist, he wanted to look at, everybody, we're a hamburger consuming nation now. Nobody hardly eats roasts. So really, the end meats that used to be cut up in roasts and some hamburger is now going, we may get some out of the middle going to steaks, and the rest of it goes into the grind anyway. And he wanted to look at, if we just took these cattle, raised them on pasture, and put them all into hamburger, how much, would that be economically sustainable to do that compared to feed them in the feedlot for a high-end, high-quality steak type of thing. So we had, the first year we had 56 steers, 28 went to West Texas A&M to their research feedlot. They're finished on the standard 92 or 3% concentrate diet. 28 were kept at the University of Arkansas. And they all went through the same standard stocker program. The ones in northern Arkansas at Fayetteville, they're fall calving, so they went through a summer stocker program and then started on feed. The ones in southwest Arkansas at Hope, where I was, they're spring-born, fall weaned. We put them on wheat pasture through the fall and winter, and then started them on a summer finishing program. So the two groups of cattle, 14 head went to the feedlot on day 162, 14 head stayed on pasture, and these were slaughtered about 2 weeks apart, March the 30th versus April the 6th. This is the cattle in northern Arkansas, northern Arkansas. The cattle from southern Arkansas, we had the same type of thing, only we split them, and they were killed about right at 2 months apart, 7/20 versus 9/15 on the grass finished cattle. So when we look at, we wean these cattle at slightly over 500 pounds. Beginning of the stocker phase, after precondition, they weighed about 600. At the end of the stocker phase, when we shipped those cattle to the feedlot, they weighed about 900 pounds. By the end of, or the middle of finishing, our cattle on full feed, they already weighed about 100 pounds more. And by the time these cattle were killed, they weighed 150 pounds more, even though those cattle on grass were there for a little bit longer. Here's the average daily gains. Our overall finishing, these cattle really performed well right at 4.5 pounds a day, compared to about 2.5 pounds per day. And when going through especially the summer in Arkansas, that's actually fairly good. Slaughter weights were fairly good, right at 13.5 versus 1280. Carcass weights were slightly lower on the grass forage finish because we had lower dressing percent at about 61% compared to about 63. More choice, but we didn't have any standards. We actually had one standard from the grain finish group here, and also one number 4. So much fatter animals, but we were able to get these cattle into your standard yield grade 2 and 3, and they were about 80% select and 20% choice. When we look at red meat yield, they calculated on the forage finish with grain about 65% lean, 11 or 12% fat, and 20% bone. Where we were slightly fatter and slightly less bone on these. So pretty good red meat yield for that forage finishing program. In the economics, grain finished cattle were more profitable. They were worth more, especially when we looking at the forage ground beef. I think Jason was fairly surprised that the cattle graded as well as they did, or else he wouldn't have suggested that we just grind them all for a hamburger. So when he did go back and this is the calculation where we cut out the middle meats and ground the ends, they were more profitable to do that than to use the whole animal for ground beef. So the next year, I was at this research station in Hope, and it was a fairly effective way to market some cattle because our budgets were based on our previous year's sales. And when we had 14 head, that's not a huge number of animals, but those animals did bring a pretty good paycheck to the station. So I told Jason I was going to do it again, whether he was involved or not. We were going to do a whole potload of fats because we had to ship them all the way to Amarillo. So the next year we did the same thing. We did a preconditioning and a stocker phase, shipped some to the feedlot at Stillwater, and then kept some of them on pasture. Only when we got to the summer, 1st of June, instead of staying with the 1% of body weight as a supplement, we went to 1.5% of body weight as a supplement. So we were feeding them quite a bit more. So about half to 2/3 of their total diet would have been the grain that we provided. We did slaughter these about 30 days after the cattle we finished on grain. We had fairly good, we had 30 more days, and those cattle nearly weighed the same, right at 1,400 pounds. Average daily gain through the stocker phase was about 2 3/4. Through slaughter, we had 3.6 versus 4. So we were able to drive the performance of those animals, fairly high. We probably kept these on feed a little bit long, looking at dressing percent. They were 63% versus about 62% for the feedlot. Fat thickness was 0.6 inches compared to about 0.5. So, we got them a little bit over finished in that 30 days we kept them out. Our marbling modest 37, that's, fairly good. And we were able to get those grass finished or forage finished with the grain up to a medium choice. So there were some cattle in that were actually CAB. We actually had quite a few premium choice on this. So we were 73% premium choice on the forage cattle and about 45% on the feedlot cattle. So these cattle are some that we'd selected over several years looking at carcass quality and that type of thing. So we were able to push that performance even though we weren't in a feedlot setting, they were on pasture. With this, The value was a little bit less when we look at the forage cattle, looking at about $100 less, but we had about half the expense per head invested, so we actually made a little bit more money, about $1,300 per head more on the forage finish versus about $960 on the feedlot finish. So I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to get to speak about this. It was a pretty fun project to get to do. The demand for that forage finished beef is increasing. We've got a lot of customers that want this, and I'm all about producing what people want. I have friends that do produce grass finished beef, and they do a really good job of it. It takes greater time on grass to produce similar carcass characteristics, and it's not something that we're going to be able to feed the world with. We can use daily supplementation with grains to push performance and get similar carcass characteristics as what we could with regular feedlot finishing. And with that, I appreciate it.
I appreciate you coming. Any questions?
Because we pasture graze, we run a purebred operation. So and we do private treaties, so all of our bulls run on forage. They don't get any sweet feed, they don't get any. And I think our customers really like it because they can go straight to the pasture and start breeding cattle. They don't have to take them to a lot and bring them down.
You look at a lot of these bulls, we bought a lot of bulls. We had a research cow herd at this place I was at Arkansas, and we had 200 cows, but we had them on 20 different pastures, so we had to have a bull unit on each one just because of the research we were doing. So we were buying a lot of bulls from a lot of them came from Oklahoma, and if they come from a really intensive production system, they really fall apart, whenever you take them and put them, especially on that Bermuda grass down there. But, there's something to be said for being range ready whenever they go out.
This may be a little off topic, but if the calves are in a feedlot and they're being fed solely forage silage, is that considered forage finished? Or are we talking them having to harvest it themselves?
So it depends a lot on the program that you're in. I think the USDA definition allows silage and hay and that to be fed. There are some different marketing programs that will restrict corn silage and that type of thing, so it can't have grain at all in the diet, because a lot of time, real good corn silage is about half corn. So,
right.
But if I remember correctly, some friends of mine back east that are doing some of that said corn silage is fine.
We were just talking about that the other day, the packaging labels and what actually qualified when they're labeled a certain way.
I got home one day, went home for lunch, and my wife was watching a cooking show, and I'm like, well, there's some guy in California, and he's wearing a chef hat and everything, and he had this really good looking strip roll up here on the table, and very well marbled, and he's like, well, this came from the Harris Ranch or Johnson Ranch or whatever in California, and this is a specially raised animal. He spent He was finished all on pasture, spent his entire life out on pasture. And to get this good marbling, the last 200 days of his life, he was fed 20 pounds of barley every day.
Right.
So it's just whatever,
Right.
whatever sales pitch you got, and people will just love it.
Right.
Because I love to go to Walmart or home or wherever, and I don't mind eating the store and whatever, just raise their own to eat, but I buy chicken every once in a while, and it's just amazing to stand there and watch people pick out meat. They have a clue what they're doing. You know, they'll pick up one that's 55% fat and think it's really good. Ain't nothing there, son.
Yeah.
My heart, check that out. Paying a lot for fat.
Walmart had rib rolls on sale right after New Year's or whatever, and I was kind of looking at them and bought one. But the people that were there at the same time as me were like, "Well, you don't want that one. That's got too much fat in the muscle there." Well, hey, I'm gonna have that one. So.
If we buy steak at the store, we almost always buy the clearance steaks because they're aged and they're better and they're cheaper anyways.
Yep. All right, I appreciate it.
Oh, we appreciate you.
Sorry.